There are a few places in America where gun violence is a more intractable problem than the city of Chicago. We're just over 2 months into the year, and according to the most recent data from the Chicago Tribune's crime team, there have already been 50 homicides. That's actually a small improvement from the same time last year, but over the years, the death toll has been immense. Between 1990 and 2010, just over 14,000 people were killed and an estimated 60,000 wounded by gunfire.
But while the numbers are shocking, they don't say much about the human toll, the effect on individuals, families, and neighborhoods. Alex Kotlowitz, author of the bestseller There Are No Children Here, is trying to tell those stories in his new book, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. And we welcome we welcome you here now, Alex.
Well, thanks for having me.
This book took 5 years to write. You interviewed over 200 people. It focuses on the summer of 2013, and I just want to read to you something. Violence has a way of exposing cracks in your universe. Best not to speak of those you love. How did you get so many people to talk to you?
Yeah, well, you know, it's the real, I mean, for me, there are 14 stories in the book, and it's the one commonality is, I think for many of them, it was the first time that they'd ever talked about what was for them the most distressing moment in their life, when they had lost somebody, there's somebody who had taken somebody's life. And I think there's this kind of tension where on the one hand, they're holding on to all this inner turmoil and inner pain, and yet on the other hand, they want to share and talk about their experiences because there's this utter sense of loneliness.
Mm-hmm. You describe a social worker who brings up the term complex loss.
Right.
To you. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so there's this informal term that social workers use to talk about the trauma that people experience from the violence. And you see, there's similarities between what they experience and what veterans experience returning from combat, say, in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Because it's a constant sense of violence?
Well, for the veterans, it's, this kind, this agitation, ease to anger, self-medication. You see that in people in Chicago, but of course there's nothing about the post-traumatic stress, because it's just they lose somebody close to them and they still are looking over their shoulder for what lies ahead, and there's no escaping it.
Interestingly enough, the Chicago Police Commissioner Eddie Johnson talked about building community trust as a way to try to help curb some of the issues of violence. Yeah. You've been in this community. Is that something that's realistic?
Right. Well, I think it's realistic. I think it's actually necessary, but it is true that the relations between the police and communities of color is really fraught, especially, of course, in the wake of the Laquan McDonald shooting, which happened after this summer. But one of the stories I tell in my book is this just awful police shooting in which there was really very little accountability. And I think that somehow we've got to recreate that trust, because without that, you lose a sense of fairness, a sense of justice.
Did you get a sense from the people that you spoke to how police could begin that process?
Right. Well, there's a story in my book about a young man who was shot, and he does something really remarkable in the city, which is he identifies the shooter and agrees to testify. And then he faces threats over the course of the next year. And then on a Saturday afternoon in a gentrified park is shot in the back of the head and killed. And there are all these witnesses, and nobody is willing to come forward. And it has nothing to do with this kind of mythical no-snitch culture, but it has everything to do with this sense of fear. And part of that, I think, results from the fact that we have in Chicago, the police have a very low closure rate. So you've got a 1 in 4 chance of getting away with shooting and killing somebody, and 1 in 10 chance of shooting somebody. And so without that sense of justice, I think that trust just erodes.
You write about Farrow, who I believe appeared in your first book.
That's right.
There Are No Children. Who you describe as initially seeming unaffected by witnessing a murder. But later you see the truth.
Right. He takes a cab home one day from our house. He was living with us, takes a cab home to visit his mom, and when he gets there, two men yank him out of the cab and get in the cab and shoot and kill the cab driver in an attempted robbery. And Farrow witnesses all this. And so 20 years after the fact, when I was working on this book, I sat down at a restaurant to talk with him about it. And he begins, it's like he's back in the moment. In fact, he gets out of the booth and starts crouching, and I have to yank him back in. And it was clear that incident had so gotten into his bones.
And never left him.
Yeah, and he, by the way, from that book, I was telling you that I read it, he's stayed with us. This book also will stay with you. Alex, thank you so much for the time.
Well, thanks for having me.